Hey everyone, this is Tom, and this week's character is Arywen for Michael. This was for the first of hopefully multiple episodes of Monster Week, where we do characters that are all based on non-conventional monstrous races. So, leaving the player's handbook behind and going into things like bugbears and gelatinous cubes and owl bears and whatever you've got that is sort of off the beaten path as far as that goes. But in the case of Arywen, Michael's monster creature's race is a myconid, which is a humanoid mushroom. In the case of Arywen, she's about 2 feet tall. And I'm not very familiar with myconids, and there isn't much written about them as far as biology and habitat and lifestyle and things. They really are more of a monstrous thing, which is one of the problems of going with an unconventional character like that. Like when you sort of going in and figuring out the rules for yourself. But in the case of Arywen, in this case, I just sort of went and I just went through the player's handbooks. This one was based on 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons. And just seeing what other artists have done, and that can be a really good use of looking at other people's art. Typically, I try not to, unless I'm trying to find out, or I'm trying not to look at what other people have done on a similar thing, because I don't want it to. I try not to look at it because I don't want it to sort of guide me or like give me too much of an idea that will kind of hamper me. But in this case, it can be a good thing to do, because then it can sort of show you what realm you're working in. If it's something that you're not familiar in, basically, that's when it can be a good idea to look at what other artists have done. For the most part, I'll look at the work of other artists as a way to just see what not to do, in case like I'm steering too close to something people might recognize. As a concept artist, one of the most bubble popping things you can hear is, "Oh, that reminds me of that." And like they'll see like your design that you spent hours on, and they'll just say, "Oh, it reminds me of this character from a movie," or this cartoon character that everybody's familiar with. And even if like the connection is extremely vague, and they're the only one in the room, if they're the only one in the meeting that sees that connection, then it's tainted. It's just that can ruin it. And so for me, that's one of the reasons why I try to steer clear. Not even just, you don't want to get anywhere near even the threat of plagiarizing something, but that can help. So looking at the work of other artists for there are wiser reasons and there are less wise reasons. So with Arywen, she there's a lot of challenges with doing a mushroom sort of character. So like there's not really a pronounced face, and the body language is different, and even the fact that she's fungus and not a vertebrate changes different things. And so this time I wanted to make sure that I put in quite a few development sketches as far as proportion of the cap and the body and the pose and the gesture, and trying to get even just a little bit of personality if I could, just in a little mushroom shape. I didn't want to break the silhouette of a mushroom too much with having a dynamic pose with like the legs far apart. I wanted it to sort of still look as much like a mushroom as I could, because even though I did go with the pretty generic mushroom look, because there is an extremely wide variety of mushrooms that I could have gone with, but I wanted to keep it very not standard really, but sort of what I mean by standard is just like you know what it is. It's recognizable. So just trying to keep it as mushroomy as possible, and just not getting too rangy. So you've got the oval at the top and then the stem at the bottom, and that's pretty much how it would go. And then of course, since it's humanoid, you do got to make sure the legs are kind of visible. For the most part, from what I could tell, myconids are either very, very, very just a mushroom with some eyes on it and some feet and hands stuck at the bottom and the sides. And in other times, they look almost like the crew members of the Flying Dutchman in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, where they're all the random fish and coral bits clamped onto guys. They look almost like a big hodgepodge of every kind of fungal shape that you can get, which is a lot of fun. It looks cool, but those ones are too monstrous and too villainous, and it almost has kind of like a zombie effect to it, where you have all these different textures and lumps and slots and all these gross shapes, and they're more disgusting. And that's another one of the good things about going with a more generic mushroom, is that it's not as threatening, or it's not too bizarre and gross. Not, I guess, yeah, gross is a good enough word. But it's sort of neat trying to work out mushrooms as a humanoid thing, and like, especially when you're trying to do it with simple parts, and not going overboard, because you can make something really neat, but does it still work with the character? And this is kind of one of the things that makes me want to. I would love to have a myconid week, but I fear Michael is probably the only guy who's got one ready ready to go. But the potential for myconids is through the roof. Like, I have a book, where's it beside me here? It's put out by the Smithsonian through DK Publishing. It's called Natural History, the Ultimate Visual Guide to Everything on Earth. And it's about almost 2 inches thick and probably about a foot wide and 14 inches high. And it just has plants, funguses, metals, stone, all the different ranges of animals. It's a big, heavy book. And it's just such a great intro spot to start with, looking up different things like materials and the ranges of certain classes of things. So I started off my search through there, looking at all the different kinds of mushrooms. I mean, it's definitely just a drop in the bucket of what's actually all out there, but it's a great spot. But even just seeing the range, like, there's gross ones, pretty ones, bizarre ones, vibrant ones, dull ones, wide ones, tall ones, pointy ones, rounded ones, droopy ones, dripping ones. You could fill the whole world with myconids, like with villains and heroes and rogues and fighters and rich ones, poor ones, fat ones, skinny ones. You could do the whole works. So I would love it if another myconid won. So if you win and you're listening and you have one, or if you don't, just make sure if you have a myconid character, make sure you enter the lottery, and I'll hope that you win. So in this case, I went a slightly different route as far as procedure goes. I didn't think of her as a vertebrate and as more of a fungus, so I didn't bother with a skeleton. I'm sure I could have put something in that would function good, because I mean, she still clearly does have elbows and wrists and shoulders and hip joints and knees and things, but I didn't want to. I did also want to have like an asymmetricality to it, where it's not exactly perfect on both sides, and it, one leg, even though they're structured the same, but they're posed different. But even inside of that, there is some variations and things. But in my mind, I had this idea for a weird sort of cable-like structure based on the growth patterns of hip joints. it's just this one diagram I had where a lot of it is it's almost like curvy, bendy lines or slightly curved straight lines that are sort of arranged in a pattern all together that make a curve. And as I was working on it, I did have this thing in mind, but I don't think I would have been able to put it in. I do have a bunch of other ideas that I'd want to try out if I did another one. Maybe for like an evil race. I was thinking of no, I can't remember the name of it, but it's that fungus that infects ants and it controls their brain and makes them kill themselves at the top of a blade of grass so that the pollens can break out the back of their head, or the rest of the mushroom can break out the back of its head and spew spores from high up. I can't remember what those are called, but I was thinking it would be cool if maybe if I was doing like an evil myconid in the future, then the skeleton that it would have would be it would be made out of bug parts where it had landed as a spore on this like insect, this beetle or an ant, and then grown through it, and then used that exoskeleton as the initial framework for its own body. And I don't know if you would like see the bug parts coming through, but you would be there for like the main sort of like muscle fibers and like tension bearing or load bearing structures, and I think that would be kind of a neat thing to have. I guess in that point you probably would want to have some parts showing through, especially if it was an evil one. But there's a lot you can do with mushrooms. There is so many different things, and I learned quite a bit about mushrooms, which is one of the best parts of this project is all the research that I have to do for each character. There was I mean, it's not. I didn't learn too much like mind-blowing stuff that would come in handy. Basically, just like things about like looking at the cross sections of the diagrams of the mushroom cap and learning about the gills, and apparently, like the large part of the mushroom is actually underground in sort of like a net sort of structure where it goes down, and they work really well with trees and getting nutrients, and they can get a really good balance going, which is sort of fascinating and cool. I always like finding out how different things in nature kind of help each other out, even if it's just by them just being selfish. That's especially cool. So yeah, just putting in these early gill lines, just making sure that the contours and the shapes of the cap were lining up sort of well enough. I initially was going to use those ones as the gills themselves, but I believe I changed my mind later on. So going into the occlusion layer again, this is just a good way to, starting off with the volumetric shadows. So as the forms of a figure or an object curve away from you, that's when they get darker. So it's sort of a cheat, but it's also based sort of on how real life works, depending on your lighting situation, where you can use shading or rendering as line art, and it can help simplify things. And more often than not, it's always there. It's hard to think of a time when it's not, but I find it's very easy for me to go too heavy-handed on shadows, and so reminding myself to go a bit more gentle like this can do quite a lot. Especially when I do faces, a lot of the time the shadows are way too harsh and overblown, like all throughout the face. Like there's parts where like it should be much more subtle, but I've just come in with just a heavy hand and just blobbed in shadows and things. And starting out this way is a good way to help me sort of get over that and look through it, where just building things up lightly and volumetrically around, and not always starting with the darkest, which usually is what I do like to do, is starting off at the very darkest points, but those are very selective little markers where you start off with the darkest little spots, like nostrils and the creases between folds of flesh and what have you. But starting off general and vague and light, and then working your way towards the specific and sharp-edged and dark, it can be a really nice way to get towards it without overwhelming yourself. The trick then too is a lot of the time and you got to watch out for it, is when you're adding in more shadows, you can be reluctant to get to the proper dark value soon enough, and you can kind of just get there a bit too slowly, a bit too lightly, and it can take a while, and it can require a lot of painting over and redos and things, and that can get sort of annoying. But it's all just practice. Everything is just practice. It's actually, I never thought about it before, but everything is practice. Everything that you ever need to be good at requires practice. But drawing is one of those things where it does require tons of practice and lots of study and rigorousness, and a lot of the times actual physical pain, but it's fun. That's one of the weird things about it, is that it's an enjoyable practice, which I've never thought about. I mean, I've always known that I liked doing it, but there seems to be like a definite border, even in my mind, between something that requires diligence and hard work and something that is enjoyable and actually fun, and just I can't think of another. My thesaurus ran out, but no, I think that's actually sort of cool. Like, just as a kid, like, we didn't have many video games, and so we would do a lot of drawing, and that would be a great way to have fun, and it just sort of stayed that way. Maybe I'm not sure. Like, I'd imagine that, like, accounting or engineering, I could see like an engineer thinking of a lot of the stuff they do as being fun or enjoyable, and same with maybe everything that's kind of like that, like that stuff that seems almost like something that could be a hobby but can become a job, like playing sports. I guess maybe there's like a whole different category for those sorts of things, but either way, it's fun and the payoff is there, and yeah, it's always worth all the extra work. In a way, I was actually sort of glad to not do the. Now, this is not why I didn't do it, but it was a relief. I was glad to not do the skeleton and the muscles, because for some reason, for the last few weeks, I've been definitely stuck in a rut about, especially the arms. Like, the way that I've been drawing them just seems to never quite make sense. And so in this case, it was really nice to come about it from a different direction stylistically. Like, rather than starting with the basic skeleton and then putting the muscles on top, it was just nice to start off with just the outline and just fill it in and render it out and just tweak it and just softly nudge it into where I felt looked right. And it was really nice. It kind of helped break me out a little bit. That's always one of the biggest bits of advice I give when people ask me about being stuck in a rut. It's basically just like one of the things that always helps me most quickly is changing medium. So if you work with pen, try out pencil or marker, or if you're working in digital, grab some pen and paper. Just whatever you're doing, try something different for a while, even like a week or sometimes even just a day. But for me, a big part of the problem for getting into ruts is when I am drawing, I'm so comfortable with drawing a certain thing that I start drawing it how, every time I draw it, I'll just be like, okay, now I draw it this way, then I draw it this way. And it's more like me trying to remember how I do something rather than just what it should be. It's very difficult to explain. I'm pretty sure I've gone over it a few times in these videos, but there's almost like I'm not drawing something how it should be. I'm drawing how I always do it, and I'm trying to remember how I do it rather than just drawing what it should be. And then that's where I start getting tripped up. But that could just be me. But either way, hopefully switching out mediums can get you out of that stuff. So in the case of Arywen, she's one sort of material all the way through. Thankfully, her cap is a sort of a different set of structures in her body, but a lot of just rendering in this case for her, which is fine and fun, especially because her body it's very atypical from what I normally do. So that helped make it quite a bit more fun than normal. The rendering definitely does get to me. I'm more of a sketch guy, and these are definitely more more of an illustration. I'm used to just sort of getting an idea out and then moving on to the next one. But this has all been such great practice and really good fun. And even like doing this volumetric stuff, like all this rendering and shading and all this extra work that I don't typically do. Even this has really helped my standard sketching and drawing quite a bit. It just gets your mind thinking about form and value and structure and depth and position and all these different things in perhaps a more robust way than a sketch would. But then when you go off and do just sketching with like a ballpoint pen, which I always just work with ballpoint pen, it gets you communicating form and things a lot better, and your mind has a more rich understanding of them. It's been enriched in that way. And so as you draw with a ballpoint pen, you're sort of like, oh, that's, you might draw an arm and you say, that, yeah, the shapes are all there, but the value isn't there, and you can be communicated so much better with line because now you're used to something that has all the form and volume depicted, and it sort of raises the bar. But you're now also more prepared to stand up or to raise up to the level of the bar. So with like better use of shadow and line and gesture and things to communicate stuff that is a lot better suited for painterly stuff like this. So as far as our anatomy goes, just like most creatures, they always look better with long arms, especially long forearms. But in this case, I felt she needed to have that. I didn't initially start that way, but she does have a row of spikes down her forearms, and I wanted those to be more prominent and given enough room to not be so crammed. And she can also launch the spikes from her arms, so there needed to be a bit more room for hardware in there, so that's why she's got some longer forearms. She's got narrow shoulders and relatively narrow pelvis. Well, not really narratively, or not relatively, but her narrow shoulders are sort of they're a bit more narrow, but she's also got a really thick neck and set of trapezius that go almost all the way out to the edge of the shoulder, up at that top of the bone, right at the top of your shoulder. It's called the acromion, and so it's going really far out there. And basically, the idea behind that is it's just for stability's sake for that massive mushroom cap head of hers. So whatever she's got what looks sort of like a throat. That's sort of another one of these large. I was imagining these 4 thick, almost like tendons that would go up to help keep that head from ripping itself off, really, because if that thing ever got spinning or moving, it would have so much built up. It's got so much more mass compared to what her neck has that it could easily just like twist her head right off and just plop. So I wanted her to have a really thick, reinforced neck for that. So kind of a short neck, but also really thick. And then with her legs, I wanted her to just have really big, fat thighs. Her legs are actually sort of more wing shaped, like they're not that thick. Like if you're looking at her from the front, her legs wouldn't look really plump that much. But from the side, they've got a lot of depth that way. But I just wanted them to be a lot more. I wanted her to look a bit more grounded, more bottom heavy, and then also she's got sort of. I was inspired by elephants because they've got their wrists really low down, and it's sort of like a column kind of nature, a column structure. So with her, I figured I was sort of assuming that being funguses, they do spend a lot of their time sort of standing there, whether they're meditating or whatever, or just being funguses. Maybe that's how they eat. Maybe they do still sap nutrients from the soil and all their minerals. But with having something, her body, she doesn't have bones, so I do figure it being quite a bit more like a mush. Like if you hit her with a club, it would like break away like you hit a mushroom, or like if you've ever kicked a mushroom in a field, and it just sort of crumbles, and it's like a weird dense foam. I picture her still being made quite a bit like that, so the fragility is still there somewhat. So I wanted her leg to just seem a bit more unbreakable in that way, where like her joint, just the way that the leverage is now on the knee, it's not like, it's still there, she can bend and walk and things, but it's just not, she's got to be built a little bit better to handle her own verticality, like her size and the weight of her head cap, her and everything, and mixed with the material that she's made out of. She's got to be a bit more rearranged for balancing all of that and keeping it from exploding, if that makes sense. And then her feet are just they're sort of like a brachiosaur, just like a rhinoceros with feet with toes, things that are like toes but aren't necessarily toes, sort of spread out, and flayed out like flower petals, just for, good grip. Like she's got little short toes, but they go quite out and around in a wide array to make up for her stubbiness of her feet. And then her fingers, which come in later, are more, they're not explicitly fingers, but they're things that function as fingers. And they're not as specific as, like, say, a human or an elf's fingers would be. They're basically just structures that can help her wrap things around. Or hold on to things, I should say. So lots of gills. She's got lots of gills, as a mushroom does. She actually uses the spores in there as different spells. Actually, I'll go over her backstory from Michael here. Let me just get this ready. Okay, so Arywen. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So she's a bard, level 9. My monster character was a myconic bard from my first time playing 3rd edition D&D. She only stands 2 feet tall, sort of thin, with a earthy color, bark-like skin body with small barbed spikes on her forearms. Her only natural attack, she can shoot them in a spray, but mostly an ineffective defensive weapon. Her head cap is a muted purple with dark brown spots randomly placed, and very broad, like a wide brim hat. She didn't carry any equipment other than an old homemade animal hide satchel, which was a gift from one of the druids from the grove, and a walking stick with a seed encased in an amber orb on top. But she did like to collect small colorful objects to wear as jewelry. Value was never a concern, hanging them from her head cap like a carousel. Also on her body are a couple small druidic runes that help protect her from harm and enhances her magic. The character was a bard, but I played off the myconic spore race more than the class. As an example, her bard song, Inspire Courage, was a burst of spores that would invigorate her allies. Counter song was a spray of itching spores. Her magic was more in line with the rules, but I picked spells that buffed, healed, and as non-combat harming as I could. Plus I picked spells that could mimic or be akin to druidic magic. She, more as a personality than a true gender, came from a small hidden druid grove where she grew up and spent a great deal of her youth. Even though she is short, she is not a runt in the family. Her clan of myconids range from human size to some being as small as a rabbit. They work together tending the grove with a small circle of druids. When a stranger visited, which was very rare, she became aware of a much larger world. This was the spark of adventure in her. She wanted to explore, learn. So she set out following this stranger, which was another player, one of the other players in the campaign, playing a ranger, and took to a life of being a life of adventure for many years, returning home when she could to reconnect with family, sharing her experiences and seeking the advice, aid, and wisdom of the druids. And And that was that. So that's her. Nice and simple. The thing I really like, I really love when people play as their own sort of, when they find a way to play as a race that they like or that they're interested in. I had one friend who has a character that's a sentient, an animated bag of holding, and they get into some pretty fun adventures. But I really like when people find ways to play as these creatures and work them in, especially when they, as Michael did when he blended the natural capabilities and biology of the character and into what a bard was with the spores, the clouds of spores playing the role of bard songs. I think that's very clever and totally fair. I would if I was DM, I would absolutely let that happen, even just for like the creativeness of it alone. But the fact that it actually works, that it makes sense, is really good. Is really really cool, neat stuff. So. So yeah, those big flanks of hers. I wanted to add some texture, just material, just because I mean Michael describes her as having bark-like skin. I think he was thinking more in color, but I thought texture would be good there. And while I don't include it everywhere, I thought those would be some great natural spots for it. Just breaking up the large flat surfaces, it just seemed natural to me. So lots of rendering. In this case, she doesn't have that much variety as far as material goes, so I mean, a lot of it was really just rendering out her body. She doesn't wear clothes. She just has a couple bits of gear, which I think come in pretty quick. So I wanted to make sure she had all these big, deep gills. I mean, it's very obvious because if she's mushroom based, then she would, of course, just have those. So it really is just a one-to-one kind of mushroom trait. Now I'm starting to hopefully notice that my ability to render is getting a bit faster doing these. Even just getting to the point. Actually, I should mention right now, I was changing the color because I wanted to make sure. She is described as being brown, or at least bark-like, so I interpreted that as being sort of brownish gray. Gray is actually bark is very often really more of a gray than a brown, but people interpret it as brown. But I just didn't want it to look like she had skin, so I tried to make it a bit more yellow and a bit more gray. Just because it can just be sort of weird if she was all like straight up flesh colored. But yeah, back to rendering. Yeah, I think the one thing I'm looking forward to and one thing I'm trying to work on is getting quicker at rendering, or just being able to get the point across before moving on forward, like as few strokes as possible. That's always sort of the dream, is communicating as much with as little as you can. And whether you do work that's realistic or anime or whatever sort of style you've got in mind, or even if it's not really a particular one, it's just all your own, I think that's a big part of what people like. I think that's where everybody always just calls it. It's just, can you tell what it is? Let's just keep moving. And does it look okay? Is it presentable? So after getting the anatomy in and the pose right, it's time to put in the props. So going through the list, I did actually mess up at one point, but I did go in and correct it. I'll talk about that when I see it. So just putting in the props, even just quick little placeholders. This is one of the things that I like about my approach, and so many artists do this, though they don't draw the bones and the muscles first. But this is one of the best things, I should say, this is one of the best things about starting off with the pose of the anatomy first, especially when you've got a character with a costume, or if they're like holding a prop, where you can get your character into any sort of pose that's biologically possible. And as long as they're not wearing armor that would restrict their movement, then you're good. But once you just have everything in the right spot, whether it's just the pose and the body's just cylinders, or if you're going in and adding the bones and the muscles, then everything is going to work on it. And I find that really comforting. Like, once you just have a pose that you know isn't breaking the laws of physics, then you know whatever you're going to be making them hold or putting on them is going to work, guaranteed, because now they're a real thing. So skin variations are always a good idea, even if you're doing like from anything from like whether they're dark skinned or light skinned or tanned or old or young or anything, or human or not. Skin color variation is a really important thing to always include, even if it's subtle, but it should be there. Otherwise, it gets really stale. Now, in this case, she's got different materials, sort of different types of consistencies and things, so it's natural that the cap is going to be different than her body. But even down on her legs, down towards her feet, I feel that like this is like a good. It makes sense to have this sort of stuff. I mean, many mushrooms do have a lot of range and variety and different values and things like this. But in the case of Arywen, I'm sort of picturing it as being towards the extremities is where these basically the parts of her body that are interacting with the environment most are of a thicker material, which has more pigments in it, and since it's thicker and also transparent, then you'd be able to see more pigment, and therefore wherever the skin is thickest, it will be darkest. Plus, it also looks nice, which is a big bonus. So yeah, that's what all this is for, and it also just helps with the barkiness of it, with adding some brown. And also, it's nice to make it look like it's not just skin. And doing that under the occlusion layer, so that you can just do it without worrying about any of the rendering getting in the way. And because the occlusion is only defining the form, whatever you put underneath it is going to work. You don't have to worry about breaking anything. The laws of physics are intact still, and that's always nice when physics doesn't get destroyed in your artwork. Although in this case, I'm setting up once again a curves layer just to help punch up the values. I always tend to work drab or dull. When left to my own devices, a lot of the time my colors will end up just sort of being fairly washed out and dull. And setting up a curves layer is a great way to kind of compensate for that after the fact. Now, I am always trying to make it so that I'm getting better at that. I do see that as a flaw in my abilities. I believe that you're not really where you should be until you could take your digital painting and reproduce it more or less, or to a sellable level with real paint. Now, I really don't paint very often. I haven't painted since Christmas, but I really am bothered by the idea of letting digital do stuff for you and solve your problems for you. Because if you see something done in digital, it's just light in little spots, and that's just what painting is. And you can see stuff like just amazing concept art and work that was done with real materials, and then real stuff or amazing concept art that was done digitally. And there's just how am I going to say all this? Because I don't want to disparage digital art, and I'm not saying that it's not real art and that painting is real art and digital art isn't. Of course not. But there's something. I think there's something to really be said about an artist who is a slave to digital and can't accomplish things without their special equipment. I've always been a fan of being able to say. I learned this from one of my fellow teachers when I was a teacher. He was saying that like a good artist can make something amazing if all they had was poop and a stick. And I think a lot of artists get too dependent on one thing, and once they have to work in a different way then they can't, and that's really kind of a mark of how much was it really them and how much is really just their material, what's really impressing people here. But I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say if you can't pick the right, basically with using curves and stuff, it's something I'm trying to work on, because if you can't pick the right color then you can't pick the right color. And if you have to get a curves layer to help you out, then I mean, whatever. If you can, you should do whatever you can to make it better. But you should also learn to be able to paint stuff without the help. It's no matter where you stand, it is stronger to be able to not need them. However, curves layers, the one thing I do like about them is that they do provide some level of an effect that you just can't get any other way. The way that they, especially when you start playing with the colors in particular, like the different color channels, the way that they make the colors blend and interact is something that you can't paint into something, and it's one of the things that I love so much about them, about playing with curves, and rather than like levels and things, is that there's just that the way that it just works with the colors is just so fantastic. I'm going to do a curves, a video on curves and things like that, but yeah, I hope I'm not sounding like an old curmudgeon. Even though I am a curmudgeon, I'm not ashamed of being a curmudgeon. I don't want people to disparage or feel disparaged about if they only do digital art, because really, even before this Christmas, I hadn't painted in probably 5 years. So it's not like a big crusade that I'm on. But I just think that you should always be growing. You should always be developing. And I think a good mark of, or a thing that you should be bothered about is if you ever notice that you can paint like a wizard in Photoshop, but you can't get anywhere close with real paint. It's a good test of where you're really at. Like, are you really being able to spot the colors? Can you really create color? Can you really control your brush? Or is it all just, or are you only, can you only work if you have electricity and an expensive computer and an expensive software set, and some fancy hardware? That's what I'm getting at. But either way, you should always be. Don't worry about it. I'm just an old crone, so just do whatever you like. Okay, so this is where I messed up. So in the description, what I had forgotten, I was getting so into it. I loved this. I loved working on this bag, this druidic bag. Because I was thinking of something with a wicker, like having it be made out of wicker. But then I forgot that the description said that it was made out of hide. So I did notice that later. And I corrected it. But that was where I messed up. But as long as it looks druidic, when I think of druids, it's mostly as much nature as you can get. Occasionally there might be like a little trinket or something made of metal, but by and large it's animal parts and tree parts. But because also, since she's 2 feet tall, I thought having like a leaf for a flap and split down the middle, the scale I think would work out. Still quite a big leaf. Where I'm from, it's really rare that you ever have a leaf that's like as big as your hand. That's like novelty huge. Like when I find a leaf like that, I want to like bring it home and show my mom if I lived at home still. But it's so cool. The idea of like massive leaves, it's so neat to me. But anyway, so I thought it would be suitable for her to have that down there. Something that almost maybe one of the younger druid people, like maybe like some little girl there had made it for her. So it's just sort of made out of found materials, just nice and druidy. And over here, this gnarled stick with a bit of amber. Sort of like the guy from Jurassic Park, of course. Amber's fun to do, but it's pretty tough. Just with every sort of like gem or ooze or gel or anything like that, there's a lot of forgiveness. There's a lot of room for error and exploration, and there's a lot of ways to get it right and a lot of ways to get it wrong, but thankfully there's a lot of ways to get it right. I'm just looking at reference and a picture to make sure that you're just sort of getting how the light bends and what sort of colors are involved and how they're affected by the density of the material or anything. You can get away with quite a bit, so I didn't try to blow anybody's mind with this one, so I'm just making sure that you can sort of see the 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 branches going back and through and making sure that they're being refracted a bit. You don't want to have like a perfect one-to-one. Even though that it's hard to get it right, as long as you make that effort to show any sort of refraction, it's going to be really rare that somebody's going to say like, hey, the refraction index dictates that because of this viewing angle, this light would be refracted at that angle, and you've got it wrong. You're definitely going to be more powerful as an artist if you do keep track of what angle light will refract at. But I don't think you're going to get in trouble. Yeah, I don't think you're going to get called out if you don't. It might be a little bit too far. So, but either way, knowledge is power. So right here, it's a little bit difficult to see after it's all been rendered out, but it is a seed. But I wanted to have that little sprout coming out at the bottom, so it's like the main ball of the seed with the one sprout, and then a tiny little baby leaf sticking out the bottom. And I thought it'd be good as like a symbol of like life, and I guess like everlasting life, eternal life, where it's like this precious moment of like a baby tree coming into existence, but now it's frozen in time forever, and it's just, maybe it has this like constant like impressive youthful life energy state forever now. I thought that might be kind of cool, rather than just like a seed, but it's like a germinating seed that's just starting. I don't know how that got into the sap from in that way. It would have been underground. I figure it must have been done by some old druid sometime in a long time ago, doing it intentionally. Maybe some sort of weird like alchemist trying to make something impressive. But either way, she's got it now, and it's wrapped up in the branches of her staff. So these are the specs I was talking about, trying to put these in. For some reason, it took me a while to get them how I kind of wanted them. These ones, they started looking too hard and scale-like. I didn't want them to look like hard and shiny. I did want them to look more like just the material that she is. Like these right now, they're looking really glossy, almost like obsidian, and that just wasn't gonna work. It was too gross and too mean. It seemed like almost too big of a leap between what she's made out of and what these would be made out of. So I did work out and just ended up making them a bit softer, so they're just a bit like, I picture them being something like, they don't need to be like, they do shoot out, so I'm assuming that they can stick into stuff, but I don't, with natural objects, something doesn't have to be hard and super pointy. The pointiness helps, but they don't have to be like a hard spike in order to stick into stuff. There's so much room for weird little fibers and barbs and like atomic level points that just show up on things as being means of getting stuck into stuff. Like if you've ever touched the end of a porcupine quill, it looks like, yeah, it might be like you assume that it's going to hurt like a thumbtack or like a sewing needle. But if you ever just like really super lightly touch the end of a porcupine needle, it hurts like hell. It just goes right in. It's super, oh my goodness, it just somehow, it's so much sharper. And nature is full of all these weird little like surprising things. Or even the last time I was back in my hometown, or the second last time, I was visiting with my friends, and we went for this really big long walk into this valley, and there's burrs everywhere, and we ended up with a ball that was about 20 pounds of burrs that we collected from the bushes and made, and one of my friends wore them as a big beard, and it was really funny, but just the way that they would like we could throw them at each other and they would stick, and then it was just like Velcro. It was like super Velcro, and I'm pretty sure that's what Velcro is actually based on. But just these little soft plants and things like sticking in. I mean, the burrs are different because they're just sort of hooking onto fibers and things. But But it's amazing how strong the connections can be, and what little tiny structures can do. So either way, I figured there was room for that sort of interpretation on the spikes without making them these gross, hard-looking things. I think it fits with her better. I think it's not as gross, but also I did end up giving her these sort of flaps, I guess you'd say, or like these sort of slits or gills down her arms. That's just to sort of belie a little bit of like some functionality to the spikes. Like there's like they can sort of flare open a little bit or open up, or like you could like it is sort of gross, but you could like open up there and see like little smaller spikes growing in, sort of to replace the larger ones and stuff. Like I don't think they'd like lift up like a dress like really big or anything, but they would. You know, there's just something more there than just. You never just want to have a spike sticking out of something just all by itself. It actually sort of reminds me of one of the I say that you don't want to have it be like Mount Doom, where you have this big area of just ground, and then all of a sudden just like one big sort of mountain. Although I think Mount Rainier is sort of like that in Washington, but there's mountains around it still. But you don't want to have just one big mountain plopped out in the middle of a desert, because it looks weird. Now in Lord of the Rings it works because it was actually specifically created by something with a mind, so it makes it's allowable because it isn't a natural structure. It was deliberately put there, and so it makes sense that it doesn't have to rely on the tectonics and the terrain surrounding it. But either way, or even something like that's why I call it what it is, even though Mount Doom works because of what it is in the story. That's in Lord of the Rings, just in case you don't know what I'm talking about. But there's something that a lot of, especially amateur artists and many professionals, especially in the last like the decades leading up to now, is like creatures with spikes, and it's just a spike sticking out just for out of nowhere, and it looks so horrible and artificial and bad and just so just amateuristic, I guess. Or like you see a lot of the time like horns on dragons, there's just not enough structure around it. There's not enough hinting at something. It just looks so plastic and phony when you just have nothing, and then spike, and then nothing. And that's something to watch out for. You need to have that build up, even if it's a sudden build up. It doesn't have to be like too steady or anything, but there should just be some compensation or modification around an area to show that to ground whatever feature you have in there. Oh yeah, one thing I also forgot to mention is a bit of translucency around the side of the cap there. Just were little spots where you might have some light poking through. I thought that would just be a good way to show a bit of the material. There's some subsurface light, sort of subsurface scattering going through, just to help give it some depth and life to it. Now, before we run out of time, I asked if there's anybody had any questions for this character on Twitter. So from Michael, the man himself, he asked, I look forward to seeing the vid. What inspired you to place the eyes on the inner cap and not in the stock like a typical myconid? So typical myconids have eyes basically where a humanoid thing would have eyes. I felt this would be a good chance to make it even less human. I don't see these as being mushrooms becoming like humans, like an ant, or they're not. They just sort of more happen to be upright creatures, and so I think that having a face. Oh my goodness, just a Hummer, an H2 Hummer, just a limo version drove by, and it looked terrible. Okay, anyway, so I don't think, like, the thing is, like, I just don't want to make it so that they're always living up to what a human would expect them to look like or would need them to look like. And I thought a great way to do this is to show that, like, no, this isn't human, it's not made for humans. We can get along with each other, but it's not like a human thing. Is putting the eyes in a different spot, or like not giving it an explicit face. It would be really easy to get along with like an alien or a monster race if it looked kind of humanish, but I think it's neat to see the disparity between something that's a bit more monstrous, because it is Monster Week, and something that's also very calm and peaceful. Like something you might not be able to get along with immediately. Like it doesn't have big baby doe eyes, but you eventually learn to trust it, even though we look monstrously different. So I also thought like having two eyes isn't also a necessity, and that it would actually be really beneficial to a Myconid to have more of a range of view. It might suit them a bit better, because I mean, if they don't have a face, they don't necessarily have a certain side or one that they need or prefer. Even though I think I did the way that her body is shaped, she just sort of does have a side. But but yeah, having the eyes around, I don't think I have them painted in yet, but there's an array of eyes on the inside of the cap where she's sort of looking down and around. Yeah, just I was also thinking them as sort of, there's room for them as being something more like a spore. There could even be more eyes around. I was originally going to include like with different sizes of pits, like different sort of sensory pits on the top of the cap, and there could be even things that would count as eyes, or some sort of electromagnetic field sensors like a shark's nose, or even just scent-related little pits on top of the head, just because they live different lives. They're foresty. They're probably prey more than predator. So having that range, or that field of vision, would be valuable. So I'm also imagining there being some on the top, but on the inside, I think it would be beneficial for them to have it all the way in a cascade around there. So I hope that explains it. There's one other question, but before I answer that, I want to get to this carousel of little doodads that she's got. So I was hoping this chess piece would look kind of like ivory, a little bit like something made maybe bone. So there's a little bit of subsurface scattering in there. But she's got she wears she finds little trinkets that she likes, usually based on how colorful they are, around her head cap. And so I thought it'd be nice if she had sort of like a doily that would fit around on the roundness of her cap, that could then be used, like, I mean, Michael even described it as being a carousel, which I thought was a perfect way to put it. So, or sort of like a baby mobile. But I figured putting all these different little bits and doodads around, like, I mean, I've got some rings, a jack from that game that kids would play in movies from the 30s, and then chess piece, and like a gold button or a brass button, some sort of metallic button, little bits of jewelry here, a key and a fish hook, just things that she would maybe find pretty or interesting or fun or colorful, just sort of around there in a way. At first I drew the ring, like the first ring I drew it too small, and when I remembered that she was 2 feet tall, and and then if she had rings on there, they would be a lot bigger on her. So they got to be scaled up quite a bit. So that's what's going on here. And then for the second question, asked by Jesse Dillinger, what mushrooms did you use as reference, and why those particular ones? I ask because my conids typically look spongy. Spongy, I'd imagine he's referring to like the aquatic sponge, and they do. Very much like corals with like tubes and the fan-shaped structures. Sadly, I don't remember exactly the branding or the type of mushrooms that I was using, but generally there's a kind sort of called like agaricales, Agaricales. Very sort of typical mushrooms, but I went for them because of they did have like a bark-like stalk with coloration and texture, but they also had really nice aesthetic looking gills with a brown edge and some texturing and stuff that I found, and their cap had a good depth and a sharp edge around it that I liked. But anyway, back to the video. So that was Arywen, the Myconic Bard for Michael, and she was a pleasure to draw. Expect more Monster Weeks in the future. I think this was a big hit, both for me and for the fans, especially fans that have atypical characters. I think this is a really fun thing to do. But yeah, if you have any questions or comments, don't forget, or just feel free to let me know in the comment section or follow me on Twitter at R&D Fantasy. Every week there is a free character art lottery for your pen and paper original fantasy role-playing characters for me to draw for you. So enter every Monday. Just follow me on Twitter, and I'll tell you all the information there just every week on Monday. So anyway, this was a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody. Hope it helped.